We're talking about private eye literature. After Dashiell Hammett's Continental Op and Maltese Falcon stories sort of raised the possible standard for what you could do with the pulp genre of the private eye, the next author most associated with it is Raymond Chandler. Chandler lived in L.A. and set his stories there. He wrote, let's say, 8 private eye novels, several of which were adapted successfully into movies. In his lifetime, he also wrote for the movies and did a lot to sort of frame some of the distinctive quirks of the private eye genre in both literature and film from the 30s and 40s. If you've ever sort of associated private eye stories with sort of weird little similes, like when the private eye says something like, the perp stood out like a gorilla in a raincoat, you're probably linked to Chandler. That was his character. His detective character was Philip Marlowe, who's probably one of the best known detective characters. People tend to know the name, even if not any details. Marlowe is Chandler trying to do something a little different with the detective story and the private eye story. And what he's trying to do, he actually laid out fairly well in a little essay he wrote called The Simple Art of Murder, where he criticizes, I mean that in a neutral, pulls apart and examines kind of way. He pulls apart and examines detective stories. I think this essay came out around 1950. And he says, very succinctly that the problem with detective stories, in his mind, is they do not succeed completely as puzzles, and they do not succeed completely as fictions, as realistic tales that we can enter into. The one is always interfering with the other. The demand of the plot and the puzzle part of the plot with the whodunit aspects keeps limiting and making artificial the fictional elements, and the fictional elements detract from the puzzle part of the plot. And it's neat that he was writing this around the time that the detective story did split into a couple of sort of identifiable subgenres, and they're primarily based upon this distinction. There are those to whom it remained a puzzle pleasure, a whodunit pleasure, and it had a sort of a puppet show aspect about it, where there are these stock characters. There's the detective, there's the victim, there's the detective's assistant, there's the unknown murderer who will be unmasked at the end, and all of this is then decorated with clues and red herrings and second guesses, and it's assumed that a decent part of the pleasure for the reader will be based upon seeing the elements of this puzzle clearly framed and then successfully put together. Not that every reader necessarily consciously sort of sits down and try to figure out the solution, quote unquote, to the story, but it's assumed that on at least an unconscious level, that's the enjoyment of the read, is this kind of oh, so if you put that there and that, oh, I didn't think of that, then that would link up with this, and if that person was lying, then that means that this, these sorts of things. Agatha Christie, perhaps the best known of this style, where there are fairly stock tropes, and the pleasure is watching sort of this equation get solved in a different and unusual way, where the crime is the murderer. They're not all murderers, but murder cases, but most of them are. The murderer is the sort of the X that we're trying to solve for, and the writer conceals and reveals cunningly where X might be, but always in a way that theoretically the reader could have figured out if they had sort of drawn correct conclusions all along. That's one side. These days they're that tends to remain a part of some detective stories to the day, especially what are now sometimes called cozies. This is where there isn't a deep, um, there usually isn't like a deep ethical problem, and there isn't that trauma that would come from a real murder, and the whole thing is treated more as an intellectual exercise, and only occasionally is there any sense of real stakes or danger. Um, there are these sort of, yeah, cozy is a good word for it. They're cozy. It's understood that nothing too bad is going to happen after the initial crime is committed, and that good and righteousness will prevail. This is what I think of as something like Murder She Wrote. There's going to be a masterful reveal, and the situation will be safely under the control of ethical investigators who will keep anything too bad from happening. Chandler represents something of the split from the classic detective tale in the other direction, where the pleasure doesn't come from the puzzle part; it comes from the fictional elements. It comes from the interactions between the detective and their environment and the characters who they meet in the course of their investigation. It comes through partaking in their view of the world and sharing what they see as relevant and what they don't, what their attitudes are towards wider social questions. And Chandler, set the ball rolling on this in important ways, just by sort of like doing it a little better than anyone else was doing at the time. His detective character, Philip Marlowe, is a first-person narrator. Like in the books, you're in Marlowe's skin. You don't waver away to other people, and you're not like you're not in some assistant's skin watching the masterful detective, like in Holmes and Watson or Poirot and Hastings. You're in Marlowe's skin. You're interacting directly with people. Marlowe is a fairly isolated person. He does this job all alone. He doesn't have a partner. I think every now and then he has like a receptionist, and every now and then he has someone who thinks of him as who he has a friendly past with. But generally speaking, Marlowe's on his own. He doesn't have a family. He doesn't have children or a spouse. He engages with things pretty much from the assumption that he's going to have to deal with them. He takes on clients who have, sometimes heard about him from another client or someone he worked with in the past, but mostly they judge whether to hire him based on how they react to him. Occasionally he just sort of stumbles into something. And the pleasure of the books are just watching Marlowe interact with a bunch of strangers who, sometimes he wants something from them, like answers to his questions or help getting somewhere, and sometimes they want things from him. And how he responds to it is something of, it's like he's put into these situations where things would be a lot easier if he would lie, or if he would perhaps be violent, and it's like a continual test of his judgment in people, and who to believe and how, and what to do and who to see next. There are plots, and you could maybe figure them out, but it's not very important to the success of the books. The best book of them, I think, is The Long Goodbye. I think is the finest of the Marlowe novels, and I could not tell you offhand what the actual crime was, or if there was any chance of figuring it out. It makes logical sense, of course, when you get to the end, but it isn't like laced with clues throughout on the assumption that you're just watching Marlowe try to get a handle on this thing. He doesn't suddenly draw some unlikely deduction. He's a pretty normal person. He has a little bit of a drinking problem. He has a gun, but he's not a great shot. His detective qualities mostly come down to he doesn't lose interest. He stays focused. He keeps talking to people and not losing the thread of what's going on. He's an ethical person. He does disapprove of crime, but he also doesn't automatically tell the police everything. He sort of sees it as part of their private eye's mission, which is to defend their clients from the police up to a point. He went to jail once to protect the privacy of an investigation he was involved in. I think that was in The Long Goodbye. The Long Goodbye is actually is interesting. There's a reasonably obvious anti-police mess, or at least anti-bad policing theme to the book. Marlowe is very skeptical, and at one point he tells a police officer he sees as corrupt. He tells him off for being a bully, and the guy says, "Oh, you're just a cop hater, aren't you?" And Marlowe says, "There are places where no one needs to be a cop hater, Lieutenant, but in those places you wouldn't be a cop," which I think is some pretty neat byplay. It's mentioned, I think, in one of the books. Marlowe does have a little bit of a college background and has studied English literature, so maybe that explains why he's so good with a quip and has a fairly lyrical way of describing things, which is fun. So yeah, downplaying the plot and upplaying the chance to use a private eye as a convenient device for meeting many, many different kinds of people. In the course of investigation, Marlowe meets people from all walks of life, men, women, all ages, all races. In the course of an investigation, you can send a detective anywhere. And I think that's a big part of what Chandler saw as the fictional opportunities of the genre, and what lots of people see as, the fictional opportunities of the genre, because a detective investigating murder is pursuing an ethical stance that pretty much everybody agrees with, and will accept that this could drive them to, do all sorts of unlikely things and meet all sorts of people. And in the course of some investigations, private eyes even will, commit crimes themselves if it seems like it's the only way to sort of get where they need to be, or understand what's going on. And because of that, because there is this great ethical understanding among everyone that like a murder needs to be understood, that even if we can't bring the perpetrator to justice for one reason or another, that it is worth knowing what happened, and that this has intrinsic value. Marlowe is sometimes in the position of, he needs to know what happened, but he often can't do very much with that information. Sometimes the person involved will turn out, the perpetrator or whatever will turn out to already be dead, or crazy, or protected in some way, but it still has value to him. It's like the whole truth seeker for its own sake, with real people. So he has a bit of like the scholar's hunt for some little footnote or some detail that virtually no one in the world ever will care about, but they care about. They want to get it right. Marlowe generally wants to get it right, and he does risk himself fairly often in the course of his stories, and he fits what Chandler wrote in Simple Art of Murder. He fits the general like urban hero ethic that Chandler described. Sort of, he calls it like a man who goes down these mean streets but is not himself mean. So, able to walk through these difficult situations and ethical quandaries, but without himself becoming corrupted. And that's really the heart of the appeal of Chandler's fiction.